We were working in here one day, just, in preparation, painting and fixing and installing trim and that kind of thing. And in walked this very handsome man. And it was pretty interesting because when he walked through the door, a little bit of my dad walked through the door, which was really quite special. Well, it's not controversial. I know that, there are an awful lot of art critics who love controversy in art. I'm not one of those. I want to have something in my home that doesn't make me irritated by looking at it in some way. I want something that makes me feel great when I look at it, or I'm connected to the artist, or I'm connected in some emotional way that's a relief, not an irritant. And artwork that is trying to make some kind of social comment, I'm not so into that. I don't love that, and I don't love it in the gallery, and I don't usually accept it. I don't need controversy. There's way too much of it right now. I have heard people exclaim over and over about the precision, and that you can actually see every tiny stroke. And when I tell them that he is in his mid-80s and he's still painting with that kind of precision, they're in awe. They're instant fans.
My father wore glasses, and the town was one in which they felt if your eyes need to be tested, that's not the responsibility of the school. So the school didn't check my eyesight. And some of my parents never thought the fact when my father needed glasses, maybe I should have. And so in the first 3 years in school, kindergarten, first, second, and then the equivalent of third, although I was put back a year because I wasn't reading, I couldn't see, and no one picked that up. I'd be sitting, I remember in the first grade classroom, and I couldn't even see the board. And I'd go out on the playground, I never could find my friends because all the faces were a blur. And to a child, they don't know any better. They think everyone's the same. And so at a certain point, they had my eyes tested, and this was like an earth change for me, because I remember the oculist there fitting these rather unattractive wire rim glasses on me that hurt my ears. And he asked me to look across the window of the store, across to the brick side of a building. And up to that point, if I was to look at that building, it was just a blur of red. And I put the glasses, and I saw every piece of white, the mortar, between each brick, and it just overwhelmed me. And then in the following weeks, I was overwhelmed by the beauty of the world around me, And at that point, I could read, but the trouble is, I was just drawn to the natural world, to the look of things.
I said they're about 10 years old, and he was always very tall, even at that age. He couldn't fit on they had a row of easels that were a certain height for all his kids. He couldn't fit there, he was too tall, or they thought he was too. Anyway, he had his own special easel. And I walked by and he was painting something of Vermont. Might have been a sugar house or covered bridge or whatever it was. We struck up a friendship right off. But all of a sudden, he wasn't there anymore. I was concerned. I said, I hope he isn't sick or something. But he got booted upstairs with the more advanced or bigger kids.
I didn't know that.
and I was still downstairs. And I went home to my father. I said, this isn't fair. My best friend is in another room. How can we be friendly if he's in another room? So they said, well, we'll speak to the people in charge, and they explained that he was in a little older, more advanced group.
Growing up in those depressing years, everything was very different, you know, and my parents were better off than many because my father had a steady job as a teacher and an income, and many didn't. She had family members on farm in Vermont that were struggling terribly, you know, and in debt, you know, and just trying to make a living. And that was a very hard period. We were in a depression. The parents could make mostly the payments, but there wasn't any extra. And so as children in those years, my sister showed me how to put cardboard in our shoes because there were holes in the shoes in a way that your foot wouldn't be taking in water. The trouble with the cardboard, if there was any rain or anything, it got wet and it was only good for one day. I had the benefit of a lot of exposure to good things, you know, the art museum, the school system. But my parents belonged to the Cosmopolitan Club. Every month you went there, and the men all had tuxedos and the women evening gowns, and they had a whole program, and then they had a live band playing contemporary music afterward for dancing. And yet I was in the tuxedo with cardboard in my shoes. And you say, I'm not complaining, it's just kind of it's an odd contrast in those years, you know, because you have and you don't in a way, you know. I wanted to just talk about this little painting. It's on a 10 by 12 canvas panel. And at that age, I was now about 5th grade. And I was my first oil paints. And this is a painting of a house that's still there at the end of Joe's Pond. And I happened to paint it because my grandmother knew the woman from the period that she and her husband had run the Joe's Pond store around 1913. And she was back then with me around the early 1940s. And as older women did in that period, they were having tea and talking in the house. And I was bored, so I went out and I painted the house. And I was painting, the technique is directly, you know, I don't think I had even used a pencil. I just started painting it. At the same pond, maybe a year later, my parents rented a camp for 2 weeks. And we didn't have a car. If you did have a car, during the war years, you didn't have gasoline to run it. There was rationing. So we took the train to Vermont, and my grandparents, he had a car, and so they drove us up to this camp. And we stayed there 2 weeks, and we'd row down the pond to the store where my grandmother and her husband used to run it. And so at this time, I went up in the hills and did this little painting of the end of Joe's Pond. And again, this is direct painting, just painting the way you see it. The third example, other than some drawings that I'll show you, this is out of my head as a child. It's not direct painting, so it looks kind of different. In the scene, I was intrigued by ice skating, and this is a theme that has come up in my work off and on during the years, something that's just appealed to me, that people, the joy of skating out there on the ice and enjoying the winter, you know. And the covered bridge is typically of Vermont, so you see my love of Vermont here, you know, in this painting. My big endeavor in 7th grade was doing this mural on a window shade. I was taken by the Western movies, and it was the homesteaders with the wagon train being attacked by hundreds of Indians, and then the soldiers coming in to defend them. And it's filled with figures, and I loved painting it, you know, and I had friends who would come up and watch the progress.
I'll never forget that painting. I said, how many figures are going to squeeze into that damn thing? He was so great with detail, marvelous, he still is. But still, he gets away with it. Sometimes too much detail detracts from what the artist is. He gets away with it. That's his genius, part of it.
I have everything here from the wagon train where they've gone into a circle to a couple of wagons that are sort of caught out in front of the other group, and the Indians attacking on two sides and the cavalry coming up to support the settlers.
My name is Terry Wells, and I'm married to Rod Wells, who is the love of my life, and I love him with all my heart. He's a very gifted artist. I remember the time he invited me over to his home for the first time for dinner. And I went in and I was praying that his artwork wouldn't look like, you know, wild stuff where something looked like a monkey slapped it on a canvas. And I went in and I was blown away. The work was so beautiful. And I thought, oh, I can't believe anybody could paint like that. And he continues to do that. He continues to astound me.
And my development as an artist really jumped from what would be junior high or 7, 8, 9 to sophomore, junior, and senior in high school. And I had an art teacher who was a male, which I very much liked. I was so happy because he was a former paratrooper of World War II. He was young and just a fantastic teacher. And he became my best friend in high school. And over the years, I kept track and saw him over the years, best friends with him, his wife, and children. And he told me how before he started teaching, he worried that at some point he was going to meet up with a student who knew more than he did and how he was going to handle it. And he said, lo and behold, on the first day of classes for me, the first class walks in Roderick Wells. That was it, you know.
There's a painting in our living room. It's behind the mantelpiece, and it's of roses, and it has a copy of the New Yorker, and glasses and things that would. I never realized how much they were linked to what happened, because his mother was an off-Broadway actress, and he eventually illustrated for the New Yorker. And he was 17 when they did this painting. And people who hear that just 17, and I think I'm his biggest fan.
This was another painting I did at this time. This is a self-portrait. I had a mirror, I was looking into it, and I was trying, you could see it's like direct painting. I mean, I just started to paint what I saw. The background is not observation, but it's out of my head. And I tried to show my two loves at this time. One is the city of New York, on which I was drawn to, the excitement of it, and the country, Vermont, and the nature that I had available to me and the mountainside behind where I lived. At that time, and it's been much of my life, I've had the pull between the excitement of the city and the country, you know, the nature. Now at this time, at school and in books and whatever, I mean, I have a book where my mother very much encouraged me in the art, and I think my ability visually came from my mother more than my father. My father was more literary, more words, more ideas, but my mother had the flair, you know. And she dedicated this book, it was an expensive book, on the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. with photographs of all their major paintings. In the front she said, to Roddy, and all these artists were 14 once. And I treasure that book. Yeah. Around this same time, I was exposed to all kinds of art, and I was starting to try to make paintings without a model or without actually seeing it always, and starting to use my imagination. And I started to become very much influenced by Rivera and Orozco, who were two Mexican muralists, and the kind of simplification in the bodies that they did, and it appealed to me. And so I did several paintings based on this kind of concept where you are distorting, but you can make up anything, you know. And I have, at the same time, did more naturalistic, direct from life paintings, like a lot of artists. I mean, Picasso would do an abstraction in the morning and do a very classical work in the realistic in the afternoon. So I was searching for a style, and these gave me, from this kind of Orozco and Rivera, of simplifying the figures down, the anatomy, a way of depicting things. You can see this is not real life, it's not a real Christmas tree. It's in my mind how I'm building up the theme of this. And I've built up the tree with sand, actually, a texture. So I was exploring, at this point, a lot of different things and starting to explore using sand in my paintings, and I still do that at times on certain paintings today, you know.
Well, that's easy for me because he basically took me under his wing. I mean, I just felt like I was being mentored. As a matter of fact, it's one of my favorite ways to learn, and I think he could have started that because he did. He basically mentored me. I mean, he just brought me along and really paid attention to me. And when you're a high school kid and all these things are going on and, you know, so much drama, you know, to have a role model like that and someone who shows a personal interest in you. I think he was interested in every child that showed an interest in art. I mean, I think he was very nurturing to everybody, but if you were passionate, oh boy, he just latched onto that. And I think I was happy about that because I was very passionate back then about my art, and it was great to have someone like him who shared that passion. I grew up in a family of non-artists, so for me, you know, he kind of became my art dad. Yeah. I think he explained things very well. He was also very passionate. He would show us slides back then of all the great artists, and he would have us sit and look at the slides, and then he would talk about why he thought that these artists were great. And I think he was also, I've mentioned, he was patient. I think that was a big factor as well. He was very, very patient.
At Columbia, I explored all kinds of drawing and painting at that time. And I spent my senior year producing about 50 very large abstractions that I got very facile to doing. It was very easy, but I just didn't find it that satisfying. Some way I was having, anyway, connecting with the nature that I loved in the earlier work. I sort of jettisoned all that because I felt it wasn't me, it was easy, it was in step with the way things were going. And I, as a teacher, had like 2 months off in the summer, and I would go to Vermont where I had created a livable sugar house. And that was a building to make maple sugar with a dirt floor and, and I put in windows and put in the floor. I did a lot of carpentry at times when I was home from the Navy and after I got out of the Navy. And when I got married, it gave a place where I could do my art and live very cheaply, So at this time, I switched entirely, dropped all this abstract expressionist. I felt it was too easy to do, and you find almost everyone thought they could be an artist. And I went back to nature, and I started doing some very basics of drawing again, which I loved. This was painted out of doors. I was set up in the woods area in the mountain behind our house. I did several that were sold. This did appeal to people. And it's painting with like a palette knife rather than a brush, the whole thing. And so it gets kind of an impasto, and you have a vibrancy that way that you won't have in the more finished paintings I do. It's different, that's all. This is, again, a pre-planned painting, not from life, as some of the other ones I showed you. This is Mrs. Grino, who gave me my first oil painting lessons and encouraged me in art. The hands are not normal. I don't know why I did them so large. It kind of carried over from the distortion I was doing in some other paintings. The Easter basket is something she prepared for her grandchildren every year. And the crack, I showed her the painting. She obviously didn't like the crack in the window, and I can't tell you just why I put that in. This is my memory of what she looked like, And she was someone who was, at that time, had braces on her feet and was in a wheelchair most of the time. This is a very special relationship and went on for years. And as an artist, I sort of grew past what knowledge she had, She was left at the age 30 with 5 children to support. Her husband died, who was an artist. And she made her living by painting the hands and faces for the stained glass windows of churches in the New York and Newark area. She was quite remarkable. And during the war, her children, they weren't really there on a daily basis, and I would go over, and the houses, there was rationing on everything during the war, on food, on fuel. And so she had, in the fireplace, burned kennel coal, which is big chunks of coal that burn slowly. And I would, if the fire had died down, set the fire going again and was lugging kennel coal for her and would water her plants and whatever, We had a very, very close relationship.
This room is set up for an arrangements conference. It's an area where, after death occurred, is where I can meet with people to gather information, make plans, and do the business part, and in between, and then write the obituary. And there's a lot of time where I leave here to go over to prepare our business statement, or that I leave here to go over and start working on the obituary. And I'm leaving them surrounded by paintings that just transform them. I think it's Rod in the way that the trees are. You can see the leaves, but it's just the whole concept of recognizable paintings that can just transform people for just a moment. I came to know Rod through Terry and asked him to come down, and he brought some paintings, and I just fell in love with them. People can look at a painting, whether they're here at calling hours or whether they're here because someone has died, and they can get transformed, they can get lost for just a brief moment in that painting. And that's why here in my arrangements room I have 6 recognizable scenes that just are amazing what they do to transform people for just a moment away from their grief. I also, in the other room where you haven't seen, there's a painting of the Fairbanks Museum, and I will guarantee you that and you stand where he painted that at the Colonial Apartments, if you counted the number of bricks across, it's equal to exactly the number of bricks that are truly there.
The war is World War II. My mother had done acting up to that point, and my father became the head of the English department at the high school, which I went to. And in the early part of the war, they were begging for people to work in the war industries. And Eastern Aircraft had a big plant on Livingston, New Jersey, and this was turned into an aircraft plant, and they were producing Navy fighters. The one she worked on usually was the Avenger bomber, and she became very skilled, kind of remarkable. She didn't have any background in this, and she did the first wiring for the remote control for that plane that went off the assembly line. She worked 3.5 years there. And she said now she'd never do it again, if it came up again, it took such a toll on her. And she worked some midnight shifts because she had 3 children, And my father was teaching, and then he was working a good deal of the time. It was in the bread factory. And at one point, I guess he called in and said he couldn't come to school. A relief did not come. And he's sort of like Lucille Ball and her friend are on the candy machine. The candy's rolling by and he's going faster and faster. And my father was catching the loaves of bread on assembly line, and his relief didn't come. And he couldn't leave or the bread would all pile up on the floor. And finally, someone turned up and said, well, I'm your relief. And Dad said, well, you should have been here, or I'm here. The one who was supposed to relieve him never came. And it was like a next shift. And so he had worked like a double shift. And then the man started arguing with him, well, that's against union rules. You can't work that many hours. It was so funny. Montclair at that time, trains were the main way of getting into New York or Newark. And this is when I did, on the train, sketching. This was the first of the sketching I did that day. I had a sketchbook, and I was going to New York and went to like the ferry slip, and when I was waiting for the ferry, this was like a tugboats or whatever I saw on the Hudson there. And so I was drawing all the time, and this was a street scene where I came in, 10th or what, the avenue is there, on that side in New York. I walked across to 5th Avenue and then up to Central Park, and this was one of the streets. I stopped and just drew what I saw, I was just drawing the whole day. All right, this to me was pleasure. This is what I wanted to do. After the Art Students League in 1950, the very end of the year, I went into the United States Navy and was there almost 4 years. And during that period, I was writing letters home to family, and I was doing drawings of what I saw. This one, I have a painting in the house that grew out of this at that time when I was home on a Liberty from the ship. This is a scene of the Mediterranean, and it's a drawing I did with ink and colored pencils. This is one to an Oriental rug factory on Rhodes, and it was just a child here who was working these long hours making an Oriental rug, and this is my memory of that. This is from Flip Eye, and kind of imaginative. I saw a boy with a kite there in the Greek ruins. This is one I did of memories of visiting Switzerland. This is one of, I think from Seville, of seeing the traditional Spanish dancing in the cafe. This was of memory of a bullfight I saw in Palermo. I did see a man thrown by a by a bull, just like that. That's why I did it. The ship would go for tours of duty. It seemed to me it was like 6 months at a time in the Mediterranean, then go back to the States and be relieved by another ship. And the ship came to anchor off Gulf Juan in France. And I had liberty one afternoon, and I went in the launch because the ship was too big. There was no wharf big enough or deep enough the water for the ship to come in. I took to the dock there and took a bus to Nice. And my idea was I'd never been to Nice before, just to walk around and see the city and have a nice dinner and come back. I was by myself. And I got off the bus, and I was down practically the first block, walking by what was an antique store where they had art and antiques. And I saw in the window this lithograph of Matisse framed for sale. And I walked in and spoke to the proprietor and asked the price of it and asked about it. And he said Matisse donated this to a French orphanage, girls' orphanage, the money to go to that. And the equivalent was at that time about $55. And I realized I had just a little over $50, and I couldn't do $55, I didn't have it. So I said, would Matisse accept $50 for the lithograph? He said, I don't know, I'll call him. What I realized is this was the last year of Matisse's life. He was living in an apartment in Nice, and he lived about a year till after I bought this print. He called him, and Matisse was fascinated that American Sailor would even know about him or care about his work. So he said yes. So I got a letter drawn up of that it was an authentic work of Matisse, the master. And he put cardboard on each side and wrapped it for me. And at that point, I didn't have money to even go to the dinner. So I headed back. I just had money to get on the bus and go back to the pier. Got back to the pier carrying this rather large print they call the Grand Obelisk. It's one of the most detailed and rich and black and white lithograph he ever did. Most of his work was very light and not so much detail. I waited at the pier holding this all the time because it was rough water, and I had 2 or 3 hours of waiting till they could run the boats. Going back to the ship, it had this canvas covering over this like whaleboat with a motor on the back and a sailor steering it. And you went in through a hole, a flap, and inside it was all dark. And I was terrified that in that it was all glass on one side. Someone, a sailor would come drunk and put his knee or knock into this and it would be broken. If the paper was broken at all, it would become worthless, you know. So I put it between my legs and sat in the very back of the boat there where there was the most light of it all, where the guy was steering the boat, and tried to protect it. Got to the ship, and there's still rolling waves, so you had to jump to get onto the bottom rung of this ladder on the side of the ship. And where usually you use both hands going up, I had to hold on to this print with one hand and arm and clutch and go up with the other. So I got up there, and the quarters where I had any personal space was the sleeping quarters underneath the flight decks, the catapults in the front of the ship. And there was no room. The compartment, metal compartment, was way too small for this. So I carried it to the back end of the ship underneath the flight deck where we had a fuse locker, and we got fuses for the bombs and rockets that we had to handle. And on top of this fuse locker there was a space. and I taped it to that and said, please do not touch Rodwell's A03, which meant ordnanceman third class. And no one did. I was surprised. I thought it was going to be damaged. I got to the States, never declared it, took it home, and this print went into my bedroom in Montclair, in this Victorian house that I grew up in. I got out of the Navy, and when I got married, this print came along with my personal possessions. And it reached a point, like about 10 years later, where my first wife was quite unhappy living in the garden apartments, and I thought she'd be happier if she could be in a home with some garden and trees. And this house came up in Glen Cove on the North Shore. It was one of the former Pratt estates, and they'd knocked everything down to build what were very nice homes at that time. And this was left for the builder's son. He was going to add on to it and live there. And then he decided not to, and they put it up for sale. And so it was listed as a handyman special. But it was a lovely neoclassical kind of design to this gardener's cottage. It was quite charming. And it was $18,800, and I didn't have the money. And so I took the Matisse down into what was a print and drawing gallery on the 80s there opposite the Metropolitan Museum. And he looked at it and knew it instantly what it was, never even looked at the letter I had from the dealer. Opened it up, and when he opened it up to see if there was any mold or anything, because it was just the way I bought it. And there were a couple of tiny specks, and he was going to send it to someone who conserves drawings to treat it so it would be all right. And when he opened it up, he realized that the original lithograph was on a sheet of glass. When they pulled the lithograph, it was put over a sheet of glass to dry, and they framed it, they left it on. So what I didn't realize when I bought it, it was glass on two sides, and if it was ever hit, obviously it would have been totally destroyed. He offered me, I had him go up a little bit, $3,750 to sell it to him then. I could maybe make more if I could wait, but I needed the money in the bank right off. I was going to buy that house. So I took that. And I was able to buy the house, and with my wife and two children, it gave a nice place for us to live. It had some beautiful apple trees in front, and it was on a half acre on the North Shore.
From the time I met Rod, I was impressed and admired his work very much. I worked as a young person at Western Printing and Lithographing, or Simon & Schuster, and I met him there. And he had come in with a friend of his from Columbia University, because she thought his work was marvelous, and she wanted the people there to look at his portfolio. So I wasn't shown the portfolio at that point, but I heard the lead people at the place talking about his great work and, incredible work. So I was, and then I got to know him and saw his work and realized that he was quite a very talented person. These are the pieces that we had in our home, and they are, I think, representative of a style and his interest in Vermont, of course, and the architecture of Vermont. This is Concord Corners, and I love the combination of the buildings and the floral, in contrast with the architecture, which is very much Vermont. And this one, it evokes what was so typical of Vermont, the summer fairs and everyone going out. And in particular with this one, there's a figure of a father holding hands with his daughter and walking along, and the daughter always think about Karen, my daughter Karen, because I guess she was the model for that concept of a family and family fun, and also the fairs and all the lights are very evocative, set against the greens and the fall. Usually those fairs are in the fall. And they mean a lot in the country, more so than, I think, city life.
This was a major effort on my part in the summer, working from the sugar house. I went up just outside, like 12 feet from the door, sat in the grass. We had a lot of clover there that was blossoming. And for 2 weeks, I drew with white and black ink on this pastel paper the clover at my feet, you know, each blossom, each petal. And that was going back to a kind of a detail that no one was doing at that time. You'd have to go back into the European masters or Durer or other artists who would do that kind of work. At that time, I was teaching in Englewood, New Jersey, and one of my students' mothers, I was talking to her and telling her I was an artist and art teacher and that I painted and drew myself. And she said, well, I'd like to see some of your drawings. And she was the editor at Gourmet magazine, which I didn't realize. So she asked me to bring in some of the work. And I brought in specifically this drawing and another one of the barn that I'd done that summer. And she liked them so much that she bought the reproduction rights for them, and both appeared in Gourmet magazine that year. And it started me in a way of making money, which you needed to do as a person, as an artist, in magazine illustration. And over the years, I was teaching, but I did drawings for Good Housekeeping, House Beautiful, 17, American Girl magazine, and some of the main advertising firms with my drawings. This opened up a whole career in art for me that I did separate from my teaching. This is the house in Glen Cove where I raised my children. And this is my daughter, who and my son were both models at times for the art that I was producing. And this I can consider one of my gorgeous drawings that I did because of the scale of it, the difficulty. And the thing is, this is with a bottle of ink, dipping into a bottle, and I don't really realize how difficult for crow quill it is to handle the ink and not get blotches and whatever. And I think it's a beautiful composed drawing. This is a drawing I did on the spot, out of doors, with my two children reading books under one of two big apple trees we had by the driveway. They posed for me, and I love the apple tree kind of coming around, almost caressing them and giving them shade. And it's what has happened over the years is that I've gotten older and my wife's health has failed somewhat. I just can't go out and paint the whole day or stand by a brook as I used to and paint it. So I've had to adapt to find another way to produce my art. My wife is bedridden. She has Parkinson's, and I love her dearly, but she needs care 24 hours around the clock.
He's amazing. He's my caregiver now, and he doesn't make me feel like it's a job. He does it so lovingly and patiently, and I feel so badly that I have to call him when I do, because I can't walk very much or very well. But he really knows how to help me, and he realizes that those are certain parts of my hands and my arm that if they're touched, I just want to scream, and he knows how to avoid them, and he's very gentle. The gentleness and tenderness, those are qualities that you can't buy and you can't study for. He has a wonderful heart. We love our home. The best place I want to be is home with him. That's when I'm happiest, when he's with me.
To work indoors, I needed some sort of model. They made a point, I've been reading about Caravaggio, Italian artist, and how in the early years he had a problem because he didn't have a model. And I'm in the same way in the studio. You can be facing a blank canvas, and there'll be no problem if I'm out of doors and could look at the actual scene. So I'm having to build up images, a composition before I do the painting of what I want to paint. Probably the last 10 years or so, I've been developed something of my own in terms of building collages, cutting up pictures and fitting to a composition that is out of my mind that I want to do. And so I do a very careful collage before I attempt these big paintings. I do these as a prototype for the painting I'm going to do. I go through magazines and find pictures of fall foliage and make up my trees composition and fit the photographs, colored photographs in to build up the picture. And you can see it's quite time consuming. I will buy used books where it's just photographs of New England or Alaska or wherever, where there'll be pictures of nature, or the Reader's Digest book. This is not the easiest thing in the world, to go through book after book of colored shots of nature and try to build up, say, the water the way you want it, or the trees and whatever, because this is out of my head. I'm doing this. It's based on real nature, but the actual scene is something that I've made up myself.
Well, I know at one point when I was involved with a gallery in Glen Cove, the Hempstead Harbor Artists Association, Rod was showing with that association, and the co-director there talked about his work as magic realism. I don't think Rod was that thrilled with that description, but I can see why she felt it applied, because it's realism, but it has another dimension to it. It's not just realism as such, but it's his vision and maybe his soul that really transforms it. It's not just real. It's not like a version of a photograph. It's not that. It has another dimension to it. And I think that's what comes out of the canvas. And I think that's why his work continues to interest people. I mean, he has continued, he's developed, he's still working, which I think is amazing. And different people respond to it. It was never a trendy work. It was out of the modern abstract expressionism. That wasn't what he worked in. And for people who were steeped in that when we were young, they often didn't really appreciate it because it didn't fit the trend. But I think his work has stood the test of time, and he's been able to work within that framework, the way he sees life and the way he sees beauty, the way he sees flowers, trees. That's what he's able to transmit and transfer to canvas in a way that I think other people also feel his love of it and his understanding of the beauty of it.
I think art is great when it makes you feel, whether it's anger or happiness or peace. When you look at a piece of his work, at least when I do, I feel uplifted. And I think that's the mark of a true artist.
You can see a Rod Wells in a gallery and it jumps out at you, and I think what demonstrates that is I have another painting of, there was one particular spring that the flowering crabs were just incredible. And I said, Rod, I'd like you to take a flowering crab and put it around the Danville gazebo. The meticulousness, I mean, I think it would help to drink if you're going to do the meticulousness of his paintings, because the meticulous of every single flowered shape. What he sees, he paints. It's like Rod is looking closely in showing you from afar the particular attention to the intricacies of shape and color and form.
I'd like to see skill in a painting. For me personally, it has to have some kind of energy to it. It has to make me feel the energy. Individual energy come through by the artist. To me, that makes it great. I don't know what the correct term would be as far as writing it down in the books, but I would describe it as such romantic realism. His stuff is very romantic. You don't have to stand in front of it and study it to figure out it moves you.